The history of the United States war on drugs and its efforts to impose drug criminalization globally is a complex and controversial topic, spanning over a century. Here's an overview of key events and policies. In the 19th century, opium and cocaine were widely used in the US for medicinal purposes and in products like tonics, lozenges, and elixirs. The social attitude toward these substances began to shift as their addictive properties became known. The US began regulating drugs with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, which required the labeling of patent medicines that contained opiates or cocaine. The act laid the groundwork for the eventual criminalization of drugs. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and coca products. It marked the first federal effort to combat drug use through regulation. The 18th Amendment, which banned alcohol, coincided with the rise of drug criminalization. This period saw increased public concern about the social impacts of substance abuse. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 aimed at regulating marijuana, effectively criminalized cannabis at the federal level, and sparked the beginning of marijuana prohibition in the US. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 classified drugs into 5 schedules based on their potential for abuse, medical use, and safety. It made the possession and use of many drugs illegal, including marijuana, cocaine, and heroin. President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1, leading to increased enforcement of drug laws, especially against marijuana, heroin, and cocaine. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 introduced mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses and increased penalties for drug trafficking. It also led to the creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA. The US faced a crisis of crack cocaine addiction, particularly in urban communities. The government's response focused heavily on law enforcement and incarceration, with harsh penalties for crack users and dealers, disproportionately affecting Black and Latino communities. As the US escalated its war on drugs, it pressured other countries to adopt similar policies, including strict anti-drug laws and eradication programs. This was especially evident in Latin America, where the US supported efforts to combat drug cartels in Colombia, Mexico, and other countries. Plan Colombia, a US-backed initiative aimed at reducing cocaine production in Colombia, involved military aid, anti-drug training, and efforts to disrupt drug cartels. The plan was highly controversial due to its human rights implications, particularly the impact on civilians and the environment. In 1988, the position of Director of National Drug Control Policy, often referred to as the Drug Czar, was created to oversee the US war on drugs. The position would continue to advocate for anti-drug policies both domestically and internationally. As the US has continued its drug war, some countries around the world, especially in Europe and parts of South America, have moved towards decriminalizing or legalizing drugs, particularly marijuana. This shift has led to a global debate about the effectiveness of the war on drugs. In the US, marijuana legalization gained momentum in the 2000s, starting with state-level initiatives in places like California in 1996 and Colorado in 2012. By 2025, over 20 states have legalized marijuana for recreational use, despite federal prohibition remaining in place. The war on drugs has faced increasing criticism for its racial disparities, particularly how it disproportionately impacts Black and Latino communities. Critics argue that the war has been ineffective at reducing drug use or trafficking, and has instead contributed to mass incarceration, especially through policies like mandatory minimum sentences and 3 strikes laws. Under President Joe Biden, there has been a renewed push for criminal justice reform, including rethinking drug sentencing laws and offering second chances to those affected by the drug war. In 2021, Biden announced a focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment for drug offenders. The US continues to exert influence globally through organizations like the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and bilateral agreements with countries to combat drug trafficking. However, its stance on drug policy is becoming more contested, especially as more countries experiment with decriminalization and legalization. The US has been a driving force behind global drug criminalization, starting with its own policies in the early 20th century and expanding its influence through diplomatic pressure and financial aid to other nations. While the global landscape is shifting with increasing acceptance of drug decriminalization and legalization, the US continues to play a significant role in shaping drug policy worldwide. The war on drugs, however, remains a subject of fierce debate, with ongoing calls for reform both in the US and globally.